August 19, 1944. Deep inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortress headquarters in East Prussia, lamplight flickers across detailed maps of France. General Alfred Jodl leans over intelligence reports, his finger tracing Patton's advance from Normandy. Nearly 400 miles in 3 weeks. His staff officers gather closer, and Jodl speaks with absolute certainty. They will stop. The mathematics guarantee it. No army in history has sustained such consumption rates at such distances. Physics cannot be cheated. Around the table, heads nod in agreement. But across the channel, 6,000 truck engines are already roaring to life. The German confidence was not arrogance, it was experience. The Wehrmacht had written the modern textbook on mechanized warfare. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had shattered Poland in weeks, crushed France in 40 days, and driven deep into the Soviet Union with a speed that stunned the world. German staff officers understood mobile warfare better than anyone alive. They had calculated fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure, and vehicle maintenance requirements across multiple campaigns and 2 continents. But they had also learned its darkest lesson. Speed dies when supply fails. Russia had taught them this with brutal clarity. In the summer of 1941, panzer columns had surged hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies, capturing cities, racing toward Moscow. Victory seemed inevitable. Then the advance stopped, not because of Soviet resistance, not yet, but because gasoline, ammunition, and spare parts never arrived. The problem was simple mathematics compounded by infrastructure. 80% of German transport remained horse-drawn. Thousands of wagons struggled through mud, while tanks sat idle, their fuel tanks empty. When German forces captured Soviet railways, they discovered the rail gauges were different, broader than European standard. Supplies piled up hundreds of miles behind the front. Locomotives couldn't travel forward. Transfer points became bottlenecks. At Smolensk, at Kiev, at the gates of Moscow itself, German commanders watched their offensive stall not from enemy action, but from logistical strangulation. Panzer divisions that had advanced 50 miles per day suddenly couldn't move 5. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was hoarded. The blitzkrieg that had terrified Europe became a slow crawl, then a frozen halt. The lesson burned into every German staff officer's mind. Mechanized warfare consumes resources faster than any supply system can deliver them over extended distances. There is a culminating point, a mathematical certainty where advance becomes impossible. Supply lines stretch, vehicles break down, fuel exhausts, the offensive dies. By August 1944, those same officers watched Patton's Third Army race across France, and they saw their own Russian nightmare playing out in reverse. The Americans were advancing faster than any army in the European theater. Their tanks were consuming staggering amounts of fuel. Their supply lines stretched from Normandy beaches across 400 miles of French countryside the Germans had systematically destroyed during their retreat. The Wehrmacht blew bridges, cratered roads, demolished rail yards, and sabotaged anything the Americans might use. German engineers calculated this destruction would delay Allied logistics by weeks, perhaps months. Even if the Americans could repair infrastructure quickly, the sheer distances involved made rapid advance unsustainable. German intelligence compiled the numbers with cold precision. An American Sherman tank burned through fuel at half a mile per gallon on roads, worse across open terrain. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel for trucks, spare parts for weapons. An armored division required 1,000 tons. Patton commanded 12 divisions advancing simultaneously. The calculation was straightforward: 12,000 tons minimum every single day across 400 miles of damaged roads with no functioning rail network against a retreating enemy that destroyed everything useful behind them. It was logistically impossible. German staff officers compared these figures to their own experience and found perfect correlation. In Russia, their armored divisions had collapsed logistically after 200-mile advances. If the Wehrmacht, the masters of mechanized warfare, couldn't sustain it, how could the Americans, with their inexperienced army and their reliance on unproven doctrines? The German assessment seemed mathematically unassailable. Patton required nearly 2 million gallons of gasoline daily just to keep his divisions moving. That single figure convinced German analysts the advance was doomed. They themselves had fought entire campaigns on half that total. The logistics simply didn't exist to deliver such quantities across such distances under combat conditions. General Major Siegfried Westphal calculated with surgical precision. Even if the Americans possessed unlimited trucks, which they do not, perfect roads, which they do not, and zero mechanical failures, which is impossible, General Patton cannot advance more than 48 additional hours. The laws of supply cannot be violated. This assessment was reinforced by ideology. Reports confirmed that thousands of African American soldiers were driving the American supply convoys. Nazi racial theories dismissed this as desperation. German analysts concluded that assigning what they considered inferior personnel to critical logistics meant the American system would inevitably fail. Quality would collapse, discipline would break, the trucks would stop. What German intelligence failed to comprehend was that American logistics operated on fundamentally different principles. Where German doctrine emphasized conservation, preserve every vehicle, ration every liter of fuel, maintain perfect efficiency, American doctrine assumed massive waste and simply overwhelmed it with massive volume. A truck that broke down wasn't carefully repaired. It was shoved aside, stripped for parts, and replaced. Fuel wasn't rationed. More tankers were dispatched. Exhausted drivers weren't given rest. Replacements rotated from an apparently endless pool. The American system didn't seek German-style efficiency. It sought overwhelming momentum. And behind that momentum stood the industrial power of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, and a logistics corps that had been planning this operation for months. On August 24, 1944, as Patton's spearheads approached the Seine River and fuel gauges dropped toward empty, German commanders prepared to watch the inevitable American halt. Radio intercepts would confirm it. Reconnaissance would document it. The mathematics would be vindicated. Instead, something unprecedented began rolling across French highways. Something the German General Staff had never imagined possible. Something that would shatter every assumption they held about the limits of military logistics. The Red Ball Express was about to prove that in modern war, logistics wasn't support, it was the weapon itself. Inside Wehrmacht headquarters, the calculations were treated as physical law. Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff for Army Group G, compiled the definitive assessment. A single American armored division on the move consumed 150,000 gallons of fuel per day. Multiply by Patton's 12 divisions, 1.8 million gallons daily. Add fuel for supply trucks themselves, the overhead of logistics, and the figure approached 2.5 million gallons per day. The nearest functioning ports were Cherbourg and Saint-Malo, both still clearing minefields and bomb damage. Everything had to move by road across 400 miles. German planners calculated truck capacity, transit time, loading delays, and inevitable breakdowns. Their conclusion: even under perfect conditions, American logistics could deliver perhaps 8,000 tons daily. Patton needed 12,000 minimum. The math didn't merely suggest failure, it guaranteed it. German officers staked their strategic planning on this certainty. Defense lines were positioned assuming Patton would halt. Reserves were deployed to other sectors. The conviction was absolute. Logistics would strangle the American advance within 48 to 72 hours. The fundamental miscalculation was philosophical. German military culture valued precision. Every vehicle was maintained meticulously. Every liter of fuel was accounted for. Losses were minimized through careful planning and rigid discipline. This approach made sense for an army operating at the edge of its industrial capacity, where every resource was precious and irreplaceable. American logistics operated from abundance. Quartermaster officers planned for 30% vehicle breakdown rates, not as disaster, but as baseline assumption. They ordered twice as many spare parts as German doctrine suggested necessary. They accepted that trucks would be abandoned on roadsides, that fuel would be wasted, that men would be driven to exhaustion. The American philosophy was brutally simple. If momentum requires waste, then waste becomes acceptable. Speed matters more than efficiency. Victory matters more than conservation. This approach baffled German observers. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed American fuel dumps, German intelligence officers assumed the images were deceptive. Some dumps contained more gasoline than Germany's entire strategic reserve. They appeared unguarded, casually maintained, refilled constantly. To German eyes, this looked like reckless disorganization. It was actually systematic redundancy. If one depot was destroyed, 3 others existed. If tankers were delayed, parallel convoys were already moving. The system assumed failure at every level and simply buried failures under sheer volume. The Wehrmacht's intelligence assessment contained a fatal blind spot. Reports confirmed that 75% of American truck drivers were African American soldiers. In the segregated U.S. Army, these men were barred from combat roles, assigned instead to service units. German analysts, influenced by Nazi racial ideology, interpreted this as proof of American desperation and predicted systemic failure. Nazi theorists had long claimed that African Americans lacked technical competence, discipline, and initiative, qualities supposedly required for complex logistics operations. Seeing them placed in charge of critical supply convoys, German officers concluded that American logistics would collapse from within. The drivers would fail, the trucks would stop, the system would break. This assessment was catastrophically wrong on every level. The African American drivers of the Red Ball Express were proving exactly the opposite. They drove 20-hour shifts through exhaustion and hallucinations. They performed roadside repairs faster than German mechanics in fully equipped shops. They maintained convoy discipline under conditions that would have shattered less determined units. When trucks broke down, they cannibalized parts and kept moving. When routes were blocked, they improvised alternatives. German prisoners forced to work at American supply depots witnessed this firsthand. Many were stunned to receive orders from black sergeants who calculated load distributions faster than German engineers, spoke better English than their own schoolmasters had, and treated prisoners with more professionalism than their own officers had shown. Some German soldiers later reported that watching the Red Ball Express in action was the moment they began questioning everything their ideology had taught them. One figure drove German planners to despair more than any other. The Red Ball Express consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just to operate itself. Fuel burned by trucks to deliver fuel. To Wehrmacht officers raised on scarcity, this was insanity. Some German units received less fuel in an entire month than the Red Ball burned in a single day of operations. But the American calculation was different. Texas, Oklahoma, and California produced oil in quantities that made European reserves look microscopic. Tanker convoys crossed the Atlantic continuously. Operation Pluto, pipelines laid beneath the English Channel, delivered fuel directly from Britain into France through underwater pipes German intelligence hadn't even detected. The Americans could afford to burn fuel delivering fuel because behind their logistics stood an industrial base that treated petroleum as effectively infinite. Where German doctrine demanded conserve every drop, American doctrine stated deliver whatever advances require. General Major Walter Warlimont observed bitterly, "The Americans burn more gasoline, moving gasoline, than we allocate to panzer armies for combat operations." What sounded absurd to German ears was perfect rationality to American planners. The fuel burned in transit was overhead, the cost of maintaining momentum. And momentum, the Americans understood, was victory. German military culture valued planning. American military culture valued adaptation. When bridges were destroyed, German engineers calculated reconstruction timelines in weeks. American engineers bulldozed temporary bypasses in hours. When roads proved impassable, German convoys halted and awaited repair. American trucks drove through fields, across rubble, sometimes through shallow rivers, with waterproof engines sputtering but surviving. The Red Ball Express developed its own improvisational rhythm. Maintenance schedules were abandoned in favor of roadside triage. Fix it in 15 minutes or strip it for parts and push it aside. Engines were swapped using mobile cranes in under an hour. Convoys that encountered traffic jams simply created new routes across open terrain. German reconnaissance reported these chaotic improvisations with disbelief. They expected organized supply systems to collapse under such conditions. Instead, the Americans thrived. They didn't require elegance or efficiency, only speed and volume. One captured German report stated, "The enemy operates without reference to established doctrine. When obstacles appear, they do not solve them according to regulation. They simply overwhelm them with material excess. This is not military science. This is industrial production applied directly to warfare." The observation was accurate, and it was exactly why the Americans were winning. For German soldiers along the front, the Red Ball Express became a presence, constant, relentless, demoralizing. They heard it at night, the endless rumble of truck engines rolling eastward without pause. From hilltops and concealed positions, they watched headlights stretching to the horizon, convoys that made no attempt to hide, that moved as if German resistance didn't exist, that announced through sheer audacity, "We have so much that concealment is unnecessary." To soldiers who had fought through years of rationing, who measured ammunition in rounds and fuel in liters, this display of abundance was psychologically crushing. Each sound of distant engines meant more food, more shells, more gasoline arriving for the enemy. Their own supplies dwindled to nothing. Rations were cut. Ammunition was counted carefully. Tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. Meanwhile, American artillery fired without restraint. American infantry ate well. American armor rolled with full tanks. The contrast couldn't be ignored. One German soldier, captured near Chartres, told interrogators, "We did not fight the American army. We fought American gasoline." And there was no end to it. The Red Ball Express had become more than logistics. It had become proof of inevitable defeat. Rolling, visible, audible proof that Germany faced not just a superior army, but a superior civilization. And against that flood of industrial power, the Wehrmacht had no answer. August 25, 1944. Inside a requisitioned French chateau near Laval, an emergency meeting was underway. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Ayers of the Motor Transport Service faced a room of skeptical officers. The situation was critical. Patton's Third Army was advancing faster than any supply system in history had ever supported. Traditional methods were collapsing. Rail lines remained destroyed. Ports were bottlenecked. Standard convoy procedures couldn't deliver the required tonnage. Ayers presented a solution that violated every logistics regulation in the book. Gentlemen, we will create a dedicated highway system, 2 parallel one-way routes, loaded trucks moving east, empties returning west. Convoys will depart every 5 minutes, 70 vehicles each. Trucks will run 20 hours out of 24, no stops except fuel and emergencies. Target delivery, 12,500 tons daily. Absolute priority. No delays, no exceptions. The room erupted in objections. Blackout discipline would be impossible. Maintenance would be skipped. Driver exhaustion would cause accidents. The proposal violated every established principle of military transport. It was reckless, unsustainable, dangerous, but within 36 hours, the impossible was operational. They called it the Red Ball Express, borrowing railroad terminology where a red ball symbol meant express priority freight. The name captured everything: maximum speed, absolute priority, no interference. The system was radically simple. Military police established checkpoints every 25 miles. Any truck dropping below 25 miles per hour was pulled aside immediately. Mobile repair units stationed every 50 miles provided emergency maintenance. If a vehicle couldn't be fixed in 15 minutes, it was shoved into a ditch, stripped for usable parts, and abandoned. The convoy rolled on. Drivers climbed into GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the Deuce and a Half, rugged vehicles mass-produced by Detroit in staggering numbers. These trucks became the backbone, but the drivers became the soul. 23,000 men total, 75% African American. In a segregated army that denied them combat roles, they found purpose behind the wheel. They painted slogans on canvas covers: Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express, Hitler, Special Delivery. They created their own code of discipline. Slow vehicles pulled over instantly. Broken trucks were cannibalized for parts on the spot. Drivers who hesitated were shouted aside, sometimes physically pushed. The convoys functioned like living organisms, where survival depended on constant forward motion. By August 28th, German reconnaissance units were reporting something unprecedented. Continuous vehicle columns, headlights blazing, visible for 20 kilometers. No blackout discipline, no spacing, no concealment. Approximately 1,000 vehicles per hour moving as if the Luftwaffe didn't exist. To German doctrine, this was suicidal madness. But the Luftwaffe was broken. Its fuel gone, its pilots dead, its airfields overrun. The Americans had calculated correctly. In August 1944, volume mattered more than concealment. Speed mattered more than caution. Within 72 hours of the Red Ball Express becoming operational, Patton's supposedly paralyzed tanks were smashing through German positions along the Seine. Within a week, they were approaching Paris. The system that German staff officers had declared impossible was not only functioning, it was accelerating. September 1, 1944. Dawn breaks over eastern France. The 4th Armored Division begins its advance at first light, pushing 35 miles eastward through morning operations. By noon, fuel gauges drop toward empty. Under German calculations, under every previous historical example, this is where the advance stops. Supply cannot keep pace with speed. Physics reasserts itself. The tanks halt. But at noon, Red Ball convoys are already waiting. Trucks roll directly into forward assembly areas. Fuel hoses connect to Sherman tanks, still warm from combat. Ammunition crates are unloaded and distributed within minutes. The division doesn't stop. It refuels on the move, and by mid-afternoon, the advance resumes, another 32 miles before nightfall. Total distance covered, 67 miles in a single day. When German staff officers read reconnaissance reports, they refuse to believe them. Their doctrine states that even under ideal conditions, paved roads, no combat, perfect weather, an armored force can advance perhaps 20 to 30 miles daily. 67 is physically impossible. Mechanical failures alone would prevent it. But multiple intelligence sources confirm the same figure. The Americans are doing exactly that, and they're doing it across multiple divisions simultaneously. Radio intercepts reveal something even more shocking. American commanders are broadcasting positions openly, without code, because they're moving faster than German forces can react. Wehrmacht staff officers pore over these transmissions in disbelief. The enemy isn't even bothering to conceal his movements. The psychological effect is devastating. German defensive planning had been built entirely around the assumption that Patton would reach a culminating point, a moment when supply could not match speed, when logistics would force an operational pause. That point was supposed to be their opportunity. Regroup, counterattack, stabilize the front. That point never arrives. Instead, the faster Patton advances, the stronger he becomes. Ammunition appears before it's requested. Fuel arrives before tanks run dry. Spare parts materialize as if summoned. The Red Ball Express has created something unprecedented, an army that grows more powerful the further it pushes from its base. Field Marshal Heinz Guderian, architect of Blitzkrieg itself, reviews the intelligence and initially dismisses it as Allied propaganda. No armored force can advance 60 miles daily for a week straight, he declares. Mechanical attrition alone makes it impossible. But within days, evidence is overwhelming. The Americans are doing exactly that. And they're doing it not through superior tactics or better tanks, but through overwhelming logistics. Patton himself understands the miracle happening behind him. He drives his commanders harder, demanding speed, always speed, confident that supply will follow. To his soldiers, the Red Ball Express becomes legendary. They nickname the convoys Patton's Lifeline, because without those trucks, his army would bleed dry within 48 hours. For the Germans, this is the inversion of their worst nightmare. They had invented lightning war. They had pioneered mechanized advance, but they had never solved its fatal flaw, supply. Their panzers had starved in Russia. American armor was feasting in France. By September 5, the truth is undeniable across every German headquarters from Paris to Berlin. The Red Ball Express has turned Patton's Third Army into the fastest-moving large force in military history. His tanks aren't halting at 400 miles. They're not pausing at the Seine. They're smashing through to Paris, then racing toward the German frontier itself. The laws of supply haven't been broken, they've been rewritten. 6,000 trucks running 20 hours daily have transformed logistics from a limiting factor into a weapon of war. And the Wehrmacht, which believed it understood supply better than anyone else, is learning it understood nothing at all about American-scale industrial warfare. By mid-September 1944, the German General Staff could no longer maintain its delusions. Reconnaissance reports, prisoner interrogations, and captured documents painted an undeniable picture. The Americans were abandoning trucks freely, thousands left on French roadsides. They were wasting fuel at rates that would bankrupt any European army. They were driving men to collapse with stimulants and 20-hour shifts. According to every German standard, this represented organizational failure. Yet the American system was accelerating. The explanation was redundancy on a scale Germany couldn't match. Every American calculation assumed massive losses, then overwhelmed those losses with massive replacements. 30% of trucks might break down daily, but with 6,000 vehicles in rotation, another 4,000 still delivered. Hundreds of engines seized weekly, but Detroit produced replacements by the shipload. Fuel dumps might explode under rare Luftwaffe attacks, but 3 additional depots already existed behind them. Captured German officers spoke openly of their despair during interrogation. General Hans von Funk, taken prisoner near Chartres, told Allied interrogators, "We knew we had lost when we understood your supply system. You violated every rule we knew. You wasted fuel. You abandoned vehicles, you exhausted drivers, yet you succeeded through sheer volume. We could not imagine such a system, much less counter it." Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, recognized the deeper truth. In a report to OKW, he wrote, "We faced not a superior army, but a superior civilization. German doctrine maximizes efficiency because our industrial capacity demands it. American doctrine accepts massive inefficiency because their industrial capacity renders it irrelevant. We cannot compete with an enemy for whom waste is strategy." The psychological impact rippled through Wehrmacht ranks. Soldiers reported hearing convoys at night, endless engines rolling without pause. Each sound meant more food, shells, and gasoline arriving for the enemy. Their own supplies dwindled to nothing. Rations were cut to starvation levels. Ammunition was rationed to a handful of rounds per rifle. Fuel shortages left panzer divisions immobile, their tanks nothing but expensive pillboxes. Meanwhile, American units grew stronger the further they advanced. Artillery fired continuously, supported by tons of shells delivered daily. Infantry ate well, K rations, coffee, even occasional luxuries. Armor rolled with full tanks, confident that refueling would happen before gauges hit empty. The Wehrmacht faced bitter mathematics. The faster Patton advanced, the weaker German resistance became. Not through combat losses, though those were severe, but through logistical strangulation. Every mile American supply lines extended was a mile German supply lines collapsed. The Red Ball Express was strangling Germany while feeding the Allied advance. By October, captured German planning documents revealed complete strategic paralysis. Wehrmacht officers had stopped planning counteroffensives. They no longer calculated how to stop Patton. They only calculated how to delay him, where to trade casualties for time, which towns to defend until supply shortages forced American pauses. Those pauses never came. The Red Ball Express operated for exactly 82 days, August 25 to November 16, 1944. In that span, it delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies to frontline units. It covered over 120 million ton-miles, a figure representing tonnage multiplied by distance, the true measure of logistics work. It consumed 57 million gallons of gasoline. It wore out 180,000 tires. More than 5,000 vehicles were destroyed, abandoned, or rendered irreparable. Yet replacements kept flowing. Every week, fresh convoys unloaded new trucks at Cherbourg and Le Havre. The American industrial machine simply replaced losses faster than combat could inflict them. For the Wehrmacht, these statistics weren't just impressive, they were incomprehensible. At Stalingrad, the Luftwaffe had managed to deliver 300 tons daily to the encircled 6th Army and considered it a maximum effort. The Red Ball Express delivered 40 times that amount every day across 400 miles of contested territory. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled to command in the West, reviewed the intelligence and summarized German impotence in a single sentence. "The Americans have created a supply system that makes distance irrelevant. Our entire strategy assumed they would halt when outrunning their logistics. That point does not exist. The operation ended in November, not from collapse, but from success. By then, Allied forces had captured Antwerp, opened its deep-water port, and restored Belgian rail networks. Conventional supply lines could finally match frontline demands. The emergency that had birthed the Red Ball Express no longer existed, but its legacy was permanent. The operation had proven that modern logistics, if executed with overwhelming industrial support, could sustain advances previously thought impossible. It demonstrated that in industrial-age warfare, transportation capacity mattered as much as firepower. It showed that armies didn't merely march on their stomachs, they rolled on their fuel tanks, and whoever could fill those tanks fastest would dominate the battlefield. For Germany, the Red Ball Express represented civilizational defeat. Wehrmacht officers had believed that efficiency, discipline, and careful planning gave them competitive advantage. The Americans proved otherwise. Waste, redundancy, and improvisation, when powered by functionally unlimited industrial resources, outmatched German doctrine at every turn. The psychological impact lasted longer than the operation itself. German soldiers who survived the war carried memories of those endless convoys, headlights blazing through the night, engines roaring without pause, a demonstration of material abundance they had never imagined possible. Many later admitted that watching the Red Ball Express was the moment they truly understood Germany would lose. The operation also carried profound implications for American society. 75% of Red Ball drivers were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army. At home, they faced discrimination, segregation, and denial of basic civil rights. In France, they became the indispensable lifeline of Allied victory. They proved, through exhaustion, skill, and determination, that given opportunity and resources, they could match anyone. 3 years after the Red Ball Express ended, President Truman desegregated the U.S. military. The performance of black soldiers in operations like the Red Ball Express had made arguments for continued segregation impossible to sustain. They had driven straight through prejudice and helped rewrite the rules of both warfare and justice. The Red Ball Express lasted only 82 days, but it changed warfare forever. It proved that in modern conflict, logistics isn't support, it's strategy. That speed without supply is paralysis, but supply without limit is unstoppable momentum. That democracy, when fully mobilized, could outproduce and outmaneuver dictatorship through sheer industrial scale. The German generals who laughed at American logistics in August 1944 were not fools. They were experts, analyzing the situation through every historical precedent they knew. Their calculations were mathematically sound. Their predictions were logically justified. What they failed to understand was that America was playing a different game entirely. Where European armies measured resources in scarcity, America measured them in abundance. Where traditional doctrine demanded conservation, American doctrine assumed waste and overwhelmed it with volume. Where German planning sought efficiency, American execution sought momentum regardless of cost. 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, and an ocean of fuel proved something the 20th century needed to learn, that industrial power, fully unleashed, rewrites the rules of warfare. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply Patton's advance. It became the advance itself, a rolling, roaring demonstration that in modern war, the factory matters as much as the battlefield. Amateurs talk tactics. Professionals talk logistics. And in 1944, Americans talked trucks. The verdict of history was written in exhaust smoke and tire tracks across French highways. Logistics had won the battle for France, and the invisible army of drivers who made it possible had earned a place among the war's true decisive forces. not through bullets fired, but through miles driven, through exhaustion endured, through victory delivered one truckload at a time.